G'day and welcome to this rapid fire edition of the Raw Rugby podcast. I'm Christy, Doran. Joining me is going to be Tony Harper, and here we're going to break down Joe Schmidt's first Wallabies squad. 21 forwards, 17 backs, an intriguing squad, and 3 test matches before us, with Wales about to arrive on Australian shores, followed by Georgia. We're also just going to quickly preview the Super Rugby final, which of course is on Saturday night at Eden Park between the Blues and the Chiefs. But Harps, let me bring you in here. How are you? Big day of selection news, and it comes off the back of players deciding to leave Australian shores, and a lot of people, and this was probably the big decision that Joe Schmidt's made, anyone going overseas or anyone defecting and jumping codes, not picked.
Yeah, he's definitely put a marker down there, hasn't he, in a way that it could have made life a bit easier for him to, have a nicer start or a more competitive, let's call it, start to his time as Wallabies coach. That Isaac Rodda, as you wrote this the day before the team selection, is off to Provence with Ned Hannigan. He is one of several Wallabies contenders who have decided to leave, and Joe Schmidt has decided not to pick them, along with the 2 guys that are heading off to the NRL. So it has been a busy day, Christy, not as busy as it might have been for Joe, who said in his press conference that he rang personally 31 of the players from his train-on squad who didn't make it. The ones who did make it got a call from Chris Thompson, and Charlie Cale spoke earlier and said that they firstly got an email and then a follow-up call from the team manager. But Joe, we remember from the World Cup where Quade Cooper, Michael Hooper had a few issues with Eddie and his communication. It seems like Joe's right out there on the front foot with breaking bad news to the guys who are getting that bad news today.
Well, you expect that from Joe Schmidt, organised. He spoke about today about being an international coach for 10 years. And look, it doesn't surprise me. This is a very experienced coaching team. And one of the fascinating things about today was he spoke about, yes, it is inexperienced, particularly in the tight 5. There's 3 uncapped players, guys like Ryan Smith, who's featuring in the squad for the first time. You've got Jeremy Williams, the Western Force captain, who's a lock/6. And he said, look, hopefully the experience of the coaching team, along with Mike Cron, who's obviously spent more than 200 test matches with the All Blacks, Laurie Fisher, decades of service in Australian rugby, spent time at Munster as well as Gloucester. And, of course, Jeff Parling, a former British and Irish Lion. Those 3 people are going to be especially crucial for Joe Schmidt. It's given him a bit of an understanding about the Australian rugby landscape, who's who in the zoo, and it's an intriguing squad. Yeah, as I mentioned, 21 forwards, 17 backs. There's only 13 from the World Cup, from last year's squad of what was it, 33 in the end, that Eddie Jones picked. Only 13, and yes, there's some injuries, guys like Angus Bell, Dave Parecki, who we haven't seen, who's, funnily enough, incredibly, is the incumbent captain. He was one of 6 last year. There's no captain in this squad. Joe Schmidt deciding, I need to spend more time getting to know these people before making the important decision of who might be captain. You listened on to the press conference. I was there. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was typically Joe Schmidt, and obviously in the last few days we've had a Eddie tsunami as he swept into Japan ahead of the return test against England, and he's done interviews with just about everyone in world rugby media. Joe, very low key as usual. There are some headline stories obviously in there, and we're talking about 13 uncapped players, 12 plus Alex Hodgman, who's played for the All Blacks, but a real veteran in the headline, Kurtley Beale returning, and you had him in your predicted Wallabies team. I'm going to say that a lot of the Raw commenters picked you up on that. They don't think Kurtley should be anywhere near the the squad.
I was going to say the other person that they picked me up on was Isaac Rodder, not going to be there. They thought that I'd lost my marbles and my hair, and I can tell you my hair is going, but fortunately it didn't go because of Isaac Rodder.
So with Kirtley, he's played 95 tests. The last was in 2021. He wants to become the first Indigenous Australian to play 100 tests, and he's spoken about that ambition this season. Joe gave him a couple of platitudes earlier in the year, which many took just to be a bit of an attaboy and nothing really serious. But he spoke about how he has a realistic shot at the 23 and the experience he'll bring. I mean, what do you think that selection says above all others in this first selection from Schmidt?
Well, I look at the squad and I think, wow, there's so much youth. And we think about the fact that Eddie Jones's squad was the youngest Wallaby squad since 91 at the World Cup last year, and it was the youngest squad at last year's World Cup, full stop. I look at it still and I go, blimey, there's so much youth, there's so much inexperience, there's 12 players that have never played Test footy before, and there's a whole host of players that have only played a handful. I compare that to the All Blacks squad and I go, that's scary good. The Wallabies have got a lot of catching up to do. And when I bring it back to Kirtley Beale, I think of a guy who's 34, 35, has been playing international rugby since, I think, 2008, made his debut 2007. He's played at 2 World Cups in 2011 and 15. I look at him and I go, they needed an experienced player at the back because there are some scars. There's a lack of confidence right across Australian rugby and a lack of confidence when it comes to big-name games. And we see that with the Super Rugby final series that was just played and coming to the end this weekend. But, the Reds blown out off the park in their first 20 minutes. Similarly, the Brumbies. The Rebels had a bit about them, but certainly whatnot for 80 minutes. And what Bill does is he gives players around him confidence. And Joe Schmidt spoke a lot about that today. About the fact that he's the eyes and voice for guys like Ben Donaldson, who's one of 3 10s alongside Noah Lolosio, who's the favourite for the number 10 jersey, and, of course, Tom Liner too. So, look, I don't expect Kirtley Beale to feature in 23s for the next little while, but I think he's very important to ensuring some standards at training, but also making it a competitive buoyant group, and that's what every coach has ever always said about him, that the public doesn't understand Kirtley Beale the same way that the playing group and the coaching staff does. He's very important, I think, to this group, given the youthful flavour of the overall squad.
There's a lot of fascination, obviously, around the number 10 jersey, as there always is. Tane Edmed was probably the number 4 in that equation, and as we felt for most of that season, and he has slipped out. You would say Joe was particularly effusive about Tom Liner and talked about that moment early in the season where he got flattened by Samapeni Finau in Super Rugby, and the way that he showed courage by dragging himself off the floor and carrying on. That obviously made a big impression on him. With Noah being in decent form, through the end of the season with Ben Donaldson there as well. How do you kind of see what happened today? Do you think we're any closer to knowing who those fly halves that he's going to go with are?
I think you probably do. I can't see, say, for instance, I think Noah Lolosio is the number 110. They need to win games. It's not Wales is a nation that you should be beating at the moment because they've been in all sorts back home from a national union. They've got also similarly an extremely inexperienced squad. Greats of their game like George North have departed and heading over to Provence, which is the same club that Ned Hannigan as well as Isaac Rodder are heading to. But you can't take them for granted, as we know from last year's World Cup. 40 points to 6, a horrible result is what Joe Schmidt described it as. So the pecking order I still think would be definitely Noah Lolosio. I wouldn't say he's been brought on as a development player, Tom Liner, but he's not going to be on that bench. You're more likely to have a Ben Donaldson on that bench because it will allow Joe Schmidt a bit of versatility, someone who can jump in at 10 as well as at fullback if necessary. So that's the key thing, is being able to get the right balance of the squad. And so that's why I think Dono would be there. But you're right, Tom Liner is a player that's got huge potential. And if anyone listened to the podcast earlier in the week with Matt Tamul, we heard Gordon Braid talk about the similarities between Tom Liner and his old man Michael, the former captain and World Cup winner. So please do check that one out. Now, look, the Type 5, I think, is what we're going to continue to come back to throughout this campaign, with no Will Skelton, no Richie Arnold, who are two locks that Eddie Jones picked from last year. They're very light on in the second row. And they're also light up front. No Blake Shop, no Angus Bell, who's injured, no Dave Parecki, Isaac Kalia, a new man from the Melbourne Rebels who's still to find a new home in Super Rugby. What have you made of the Type 5 battle before we get to that back row?
Yeah, really interesting for me is the decision to not choose Darcy Swain, who's going from the Brumbies across to the Force. Now, he obviously does have Test experience. He is called out today by Joe for how well he actually did line-out wise for the Brumbies near the end. What we heard from Harry Jones, who wrote a really good piece on Joe Schmidt and what to expect from him when he was first signed up, was that he, above all, rewards discipline, so that he's not going to sit there and accept early silly penalties, that he's not going to sit there and accept the kind of yellow cards that Darcy Swain, has conceded against England and the like. And maybe that has counted against him. But so in a way, he's like robbed himself, I guess, of a bit of that, that experience and traded it for a bit more discipline, perhaps. The other interesting one there is Josh Canham. He, many people thought that he was making a real run at this squad, and he's not there. Where do you kind of see his situation?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. Like on Darcy, he had a shocker in that semi-final. We've got to say that, and he's probably that could also have played a part. Joe did touch upon that form in the Super Rugby finals and how players stood up or didn't. Did tell the Aussie selectors a little bit. So the inability to have the kick restarts, he's probably a bit passive. His discipline was much better in 2024, and I wonder whether or not that's because of a little bit of that edge. Darcy Swain's now actually a little bit scared about running the gauntlet by putting those shoulders, by hitting those rucks as hard, because he knows that he's had a target on his back for a while. So I just wonder whether or not that's meant he's been a bit more passive in the way that he's defended and hit rucks. You're right about Josh Canham. I think most people expected him to be there. He had an impressive finish to the season. He was one of the standouts against the Hurricanes in that quarterfinal loss. The one thing about Josh Canham, he's so young still. And I think we saw him throughout the year go in and out of games a little bit. He didn't necessarily do the heavy lifting through the middle at times. Maybe he's just gone, you know what, we need someone like a Ryan Smith who's going to hit rucks, that's just going to be consistent, that's going to have high work rate. We don't want someone who's going to go in and out of games. And that's how I see this at the moment. And I think it's good reward for Ryan Smith, even though I think the jury is out whether or not he's an international player, but we'll find out more over the next few weeks. And at the very least, Joe Schmidt and his coaching team will, before you might think about a Will Skelton for that rugby championship.
Christy, also Angus Blythe, he's 26 years old. I was kind of expecting him to be younger and breaking through, but he obviously has had a lot of injury issues as well. Is that one a surprise to you? Because that one kind of leapt off the page to me a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, remiss not to make mention of it at the moment. And, yeah, absolutely. This is a guy that a few years ago came onto the scene and you thought he's come through, I think it was Queensland country in the NRC. He's been capped at a pretty young age. He's more than 2 metres tall. There's a bit of Brad Thorne about him in the way that he looks, but also a bit of Jules out of James Bond. He's a big boy, but unfortunately he hasn't developed from being a boy to a man, I don't think, when it comes to Super Rugby, professional rugby. And, it's a strong thing to say, but he's got all the tools to be a very good player. And I wonder whether or not Joe Schmidt and Mike Cron have gone, can we find that missing 10% Fangus Blythe? Because if they can, then he can be a superb player because of the physical characteristics that he's got. So good luck to him. He's playing catch up, I'd say, because he's barely been cited. He got suspended last year for a few games for a pretty reckless, clumsy challenge at home, which saw him, I think, sent off. But he could be a good player. And when you look at how skinny that type 5 is, he's the sort of guy that you need to develop, and hopefully he's a late bloomer, because there's been many examples of that. Guys like Scott Vardy that have got better and better as the years have gone on. The back row, that's been probably the most competitive position all year in Super Rugby. When you've got guys like Harry Wilson, who hasn't played a test for quite a while, certainly didn't play one in 2023. It was a bit like, is this the year under a new coach? He looked like he'd changed a couple of areas of his game, bringing back some of that triple threat where he can offload, he can ball play, where he can kick. Great to see him get there despite the fact coming back from a broken arm, but so competitive, and a couple of new faces, guys like Charlie Cale, who's just been superb this year. He had some eye-catching performances last year where you thought, oh, hello. I remember against the Hurricanes last year, it was superb across the ditch. And once again, barely put a foot wrong, I think, this year. And I don't think it's any surprise whatsoever that he's in the squad. And I reckon he might make the 23. That's how good he's been.
He really has come on. The interesting one there for me is Langy Gleeson, who I think is a real winner considering the season he's had, that they're obviously seeing something in him that goes back before that. You know, if you're ruling out Darcy Swain on a couple of missed kick off catches, then Langy Gleeson, you could look at a whole body of work there where he hasn't quite aimed up this season, but he takes his place there. Rob Leota has missed out due to a hamstring rupture in the train-on squad, so maybe there's some movement there. But Charlie Cale, has been a rapid rise and such a great player to watch. I mean, outstanding running in those wide channels, isn't he? Just that offload before those super speedy wingers. Interestingly, neither of those wingers that he feeds so well are in this squad, but just his devastating running out there, I've really enjoyed watching this season.
Yeah.
Or maybe that combination with Bobby V as well as playing into this one.
Oh, it could well. He reminds me, and I know a lot of people have commented on it now, of Pierce Spears, the great Springbok. Just his high running style, how quick he is, how explosive it is. It's an exciting selection. And the other one there's a couple of guys that I think, and it's hard to know with Rob Leota being a late withdrawal, who was going to be in that squad, who benefited from that. Was it a Langy Gleeson perhaps? His hands were terrible in 2024, nothing short of terrible, but he's got something about him. So if Joe Schmidt can find that, great. But guys like Tom Hooper probably didn't kick on like how people might have, but such a great character. And I know Laurie Fisher's a big fan of his. Liam Wright, the other one, who has just had a couple of injuries over the last few years, which I wouldn't say have slowed his progress, but have just meant that he's not necessarily been able to have that body of work throughout a season to be able to be truly competitive when it comes to selection. But great to see him. I wonder if he's the backup 7 to Fraser McWright. There's no out-and-out 7 there. You look at guys like Charlie Gamble missing selection, Carlo Tizzano, Brad Wilkin, obviously Jerome Brown, New Zealander, but no Rory Scott either. So probably Tom Hooper and Liam Wright, I imagine, will be challenging for that replacement position on the bench in case anything happens to Fraser McWright, who could be in the picture for the next Wallaby captaincy.
Yeah, those two. There's 2 of those guys are completely locked in, aren't they? In McWright and Valentini. So it's moving that other link in there with them, and then the cover off the bench. But those 2 are, and they're probably among the Wallabies' 2 best players if you're going down that path, right?
Oh, yeah, without a shadow of doubt. And maybe Tom Wright is the other one. I really do think we'll see him at fullback. There was always going to be one halfback that was going to miss out. It's Ryan Lonergan. I thought that he might miss it. If anyone saw my predicted squad on Monday, I did leave Ryan out. I think he might not have had his best season, but he's just such a competent player with probably the best pass in Australia. I was encouraged by the fact that he started to take the line on a little bit more as the year progressed. But it was an interesting remark that Joe said that with really inexperienced 10s, he wanted experienced 9s. And that's certainly, I think, helped Nick White make this squad. It might have been the perfect scenario to have a Ryan Lonergan in there against an opposition that you expect to beat, like Wales. But on the other hand, you need to beat them. And having Nick White, Jake Gordon experience playing 70 minutes most weeks, Tate McDermott, we know what he's done over the last few years and how important he's been to the Reds. So, yeah, it's unfortunate for Ryan Lonergan. He's probably one of the losers. When you write that story, winner of the losers, he's one of the ones that are the losers, unfortunately.
Well, look, I obviously heard what Joe said on that as well, but in some way I kind of wonder as well in that Ryan Lonergan he does have experience. He's played with the Brumbies for quite a while, led the Australia A team. So I don't think you're going to – it seemed a bit like a way to cover that one. Isaac Fines, obviously, he went to the World Cup and he's missed out as well. So a couple of them have. Jake Gordon's an interesting one as well because, again, he was very good for a team that was very bad. But he did try and leave Australia not that long ago and get out of his contract early. So, I mean, in a way, it's turned out okay for him if he can bust his way into that team. But I must admit I wasn't expecting to see him back at this kind of level after that, and also after dropping out of it under Eddie Jones. So, I mean, do you feel he's kind of done enough this season, Jake?
Oh, look, I think Nick White will be well suited to a game under Joe Schmidt's coaching style, which might mean that Jake doesn't play. But Jake reminded Rob Penny of, reminded Rob Penny of Conor Murray. And we know how much Conor Murray starred under Joe Schmidt, very similar physique. I wouldn't say necessarily the same characteristics from a playing perspective, but a lot of people can be lured and sucked in by Jake Gordon because he does what he does well. He does very well, and he's always a guy that's backing up, that's a bit like TJ Perinara, can find his way to a try line. So that's a feather in his cap. I'm not surprised he was there. I think the reason why he wasn't released was because Joe Schmidt likes the look of him. So whether or not he starts, we'll see. I think we'll still see Tate McDermott feature in one way or another. The midfield was a really fascinating one because no Lalakai Foketi, who is a loser in the sense of the story of winners and losers, probably one of the biggest omissions. He's probably paid the price for the fact that the Waratahs were so poor. They've only had 3 Waratahs players picked. There probably would have been a couple more had they been fit, like the Parekis and the Bells. But David Fa'alumi from the Rebels, right from the outset, caught Joe Schmidt's eye. He was a guy that I'd heard through the grapevine that was going to probably feature. He has. I'm somewhat surprised by that, but maybe I'm more surprised by the fact that there's 3 12s there. Hunter Paisami, who's the favourite to wear the number 12 jersey, as well as Hamish Stewart, who a lot of people have loved for a long time, never going to let you down defensively, dogged, can kick. He's just a good footy player. So good reward for him. And there's a couple of outside centres and Lenny Kitau, Josh Fluke, as well as Filippo Downgoona, who can jump between the outside backs, the wing, as well as outside centre. So some interesting selections there. The one that a lot of people maybe was surprised by, as well as Kurtley Beale, was no Tim Ryan. And there doesn't seem like there's with no Marika Korobetti for the first time in a long time, there's not too many outside backs there that are completely recognisable. You've got Dylan Peach, Darby Lancaster, Andrew Kellaway, you imagine, is going to probably feature out wide. But Darby's been selected, no Tim Ryan. I reported earlier in the week that Corey Toole was going to join the Sevens program, which is what he's done. So how did you think, did that surprise people? Are you surprised by it?
Well, in Joe's press conference, he clearly made it that it was a call between Darby and Tim Ryan, the way that he phrased them together in his conversation. I think, interesting to me, I think Tim Ryan is an Eddie Jones player last season. Like, he goes to the World Cup. He's at the forefront of the let's build a team for 2027. Let's kind of bring in all these youngsters and throw a new guy in at 5'8". Let's chuck him on the wing. He would have really fitted Eddie. And the tone today from Joe was like, the whole of Australian rugby is clamouring for the junkyard dog to be let off the leash and go and do his thing and score a hat-trick against the Welsh and then another against the All Blacks. And Joe's just gone, hang on a minute. I just want to temper expectations on this kid. Let's just bring it back down here. He came into Super halfway through. He's not, it's just kind of you're not there, mate. You haven't made it yet. And it just rings true for Joe to me, like a very pragmatic decision, allow things to move on without hyping up too much as well. But you're right, people are really questioning it. I mean, on the other side, he didn't pick Suliasi Vunivalu, so everyone's kind of happy about that, Christy. But I think everyone wanted to see that Queensland winger in this team. It's interesting because he spoke, obviously he has a great connection with Les Kiss, they've coached together before. He spoke about going up there and visiting Queensland and getting a lot of intel on the Reds players. And you can see in the selection and names that we've already mentioned that there is a real, a real vein of red flowing through this Wallabies selection. Interesting that he's not one of them. I don't know. Do we expect to see him later in the season, or do we think that the junkyard dog's been kennelled until Super Rugby 2025?
Look, I had an inkling that he wasn't going to be picked. I heard that the Reds think that he needs to have a couple of more kilos on him, and that's possible. I'm certainly no strength and conditioner, but my intel had been that he wasn't going to be in that squad, hence the reason why I didn't have him in the predicted one. Would have I? Maybe. Darby, I think, has still got a lot of growth. I might have asked one of those two to play in the Sevens as well. I think if you were going to go for the Olympics, Darby Lancaster spent more than a season with that program. I think you go for the kitchen sink. You can't be half-cocked about this sort of thing. You got to go in there and try to get that gold. Otherwise, you might just annoy a few people because you picked one or two from the 15s program when you probably needed the three that might have spent time there. So, yeah, it's an interesting one with no Nganetuasi and him pushing for selection too. I think Tim Ryan will be a star, and he's clearly got a real knack about finding the way his way to the try line. I can imagine like a spring tour, perfect opportunity to spend a bit of time there. He'll find out more around the guys like Kurtley Beale, like Ben Donaldson, your Darby Lancasters as the year goes on. I'm going to, before we just quickly touch on and a prediction for the Super Rugby, what's your overall feel around this Joe Schmidt squad? Is it a good one? We know that Eddie Jones blew people's minds with his selection for last year's World Cup by dropping some big names like your Quade Coopers and Michael Hoopers. Yeah. How do you feel about this one?
I feel, and this is a bugbear of mine, I feel that I just can't believe that we're doing what is a Socceroos equivalent of picking an A-League team for, major internationals. Like, we're still here again. This is his right to pick from Australia. He's decided that that's what he's going to do. He's not going to pick players who are going overseas. I just think that leaves him and us exposed. I know you've got a sense that Wales, we should be sweeping aside with this team, or that's what I think. And, but like you want your best players playing. You've got a new regime coming in, a new coach. I look at it and I go, it's weak, and I can see us losing, and I don't see us winning a rugby championship game based on this. So that's kind of fear, trepidation, negativity. I'm a complete pessimist, though, Christy. You should know that by now. I see things going wrong here, and I see them going wrong spectacularly. I think ninth is not as far down as this team has to go. What about you? Got cheerier thoughts?
Wow, look, it's a Friday and it's nearly 5 p.m. when we're recording this. If I ever felt like a beer, I probably do now. But look, I agree, it is a weak squad, and we've got to be blunt about that. It's a squad, I think, still that should beat Wales on Australian soil. It would be a different matter perhaps in Cardiff, but it should still beat this Welsh side that's been beaten up, really struggled throughout the United Rugby Championship right the way through the season. Wales are very average at the moment. They've got an experienced coach, but it's almost like the Eddie Jones kind of, Eddie didn't have a great return to the Wallabies. Warren Gatland's probably experiencing some of the same teething issues with fundamental and necessary change needed being up there. If this squad was to play against the All Blacks, though, they'd be beaten by 50. And you look at the All Blacks and a predicted squad. Jamie Wall wrote one for the Raw on Thursday, and it's gone gangbusters. But you compare the Australian squad announced today and the New Zealand one that's going to be announced on Monday, and it's comparing apples and oranges. So one of them is a World Cup finalist and has managed to, despite the departures of Sam Whitelock, Aaron Smith, Brodie Retallick, several others, managed to regenerate. And this Wallabies side, without picking from overseas, looks like the Super Rugby sides that have been trounced for a decade. So, well, we're weaker than the team that got bounced out in the pool stages of the World Cup. This is a weaker squad than that. The one argument against that would be the fact that there's two tight heads in Alan Alatella and Taniela Tupou, who missed the vast majority of it, obviously. And yes, there's no Will Skelton. Still, maybe there's some more continuity and a significantly better coaching team. So that team will be better because it was so badly coached last year, in my opinion. But the fact that there's two tight heads does help immensely when it comes to Test footy.
Are you telling me that rugby league coaches can't coach rugby union?
Yeah, well, and AFL coaches, as a matter of fact, as well, and French Moore coaches that are former halfbacks. But hey, let's turn just really quickly to Super Rugby. The sides are in. Patrick Tuipulotu is taking his place for the Blues. I know that Aussies, the rusted on, the ones that are just rugby tragics are going to be watching it. I don't think anyone else really cares too much if you're just a casual observer of rugby in Australia. But give us a scoreline prediction, and who do you think? And is there a talking point to come out of it?
Are you suggesting that I'm rusted on? I mean, I'm leaving this one to you, Doran. I think I'm going to go with the Chiefs because I like the Chiefs better. I like Damien McKenzie, as you well know. I have a man crush on him. I enjoy the way he passes. I enjoy the way he runs. But most of all, I enjoy the way that he looks up at those posts as if he wants to make sweet, sweet love to them every time he's about to kick a goal. I really, really, really love the way he grins at those posts before inevitably slotting the ball through. To me, the Super Rugby finished last week. I've got to say, I know we have a lot of Kiwi readers and listeners, but this, I wrote a piece last week, speaking of going gangbusters, it upset a lot of people. A lot of people agreed with me. Super Rugby Pacific is cooked. We need to chop it up, start all over again. And one of the big reasons is we're in grand final week, and I don't care. I just don't care. Do you care?
Well, I think you're probably right. Those in Australia, the vast majority don't care either. That is an issue. I still think it is a much better competition now that its game's been played in the right time zone. So speaking of that, it's going to be 5:05 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Saturday. My prediction, the Blues by 8. I love the Cotter's way of approaching Super Rugby. It's not for everyone, but when you've got a big, bad, bullish forward pack, I think they'll try to go through the middle of the Chiefs, who have got the best and the hottest backline in the competition. When you're bringing on guys like Quinn Tapire off the bench, Jesus, that's an embarrassment of riches. It'll be a fun, good game to watch. Hopefully the rain sticks clear. But even if it doesn't, I can dare say Damien McKenzie will still do what he does best, and that is entertain. And funnily enough, even though he's been smiling a lot, he's actually got, I think, the best kicking percentage this year in Super Rugby. It's about 87, 88%. So that is a big one. It's a big game for him if he wants to be wearing the All Blacks number 10 jersey as well. All right, we've spoken about rugby for far too long at this hour on a Friday afternoon, particularly when there's no game to come to take place tonight. Look forward to having Matt Tamua back on the pod early next week. Great to see you, Harms, survive another week as well. And please let us know. Get in touch what you think about the Wallabies squad as well. If you like it, if you don't, if you think it's stronger or weaker than last year's World Cup squad under Eddie Jones, that'll be a fascinating one. At the very least, there's an extra 5 players. That probably does mean it's stronger by weight, if nothing else. Thanks very much. See you next time.